Welcome to Stuff You Can Sleep Through. Tonight, we're headed into the hills, to a place that looks like a neighborhood, smells faintly of eucalyptus, and somehow contains more rock history per square foot than most museums. Laurel Canyon. The road doesn't announce itself. One moment you're on Sunset Boulevard surrounded by traffic and neon. Then a turn, one of those blink and you miss it turns, and you're climbing. The air changes. Cooler, sharper. There's that sweet tang of eucalyptus, mixed with something warm and old, like sun-baked wood. The houses start to appear, some neat and modern, others crooked and weathered, as if they've been holding their breath since 1924. Mailboxes lean like tired sentries. Driveways appear at impossible angles, each one hiding some story, or song, or maybe just a cat who refuses to come inside. It was here, on these twisting roads, that some of the most famous music of the 60s and 70s was written, rehearsed, and occasionally forgotten on a porch after midnight. Laurel Canyon. It wasn't polished. It wasn't planned. But it drew musicians like moths to a warm California lamp. And tonight, we're going to drift through its bends, meeting the people, the songs, and the parties, some remembered, some legendary, and some probably exaggerated just enough to keep things interesting. If you're enjoying the ride, tap the like button, maybe subscribe. No pressure, just good vibes. And feel free to drop a comment about where you're listening from and who your favorite Laurel Canyon musician is to unwind with. Now take a deep breath, let the road wind. The sun is setting over the canyon, the music's starting in the distance, and we've got time. Before Laurel Canyon was home to rock royalty, before the songs and the albums and the goats on the roof, it was just a road that didn't even seem like it should exist. Laurel Canyon Boulevard rises from sunset like it's trying to escape the city. One moment you're surrounded by gas stations, billboards, and the smell of French fries from In-N-Out. The next, the pavement narrows, curves, and starts climbing. In the 1950s, the canyon wasn't glamorous. It was rustic. And not rustic in the expensive home decor catalog way. Rustic in the, is that deck safe way? The houses range from charming to slightly alarming. Some were craftsman bungalows with peeling paint. Others were wood and glass experiments by architects who apparently believed the laws of gravity were just suggestions. Many of these homes perched on the hillside like cats, balanced, confident, and maybe one strong wind gust away from moving to another neighborhood entirely. Driveways? They were a test of faith. Narrow, steep, and curved like something out of a roller coaster. If you missed your turn, you didn't just have to back up. You had to back up downhill, possibly with your brakes making small panicked noises. But there was a reason people came here. The canyon felt separate, a pocket of quiet just above the noise of Hollywood. At night, you could stand on a porch and see the city lights spread out below, just like a glittering blanket. You could almost forget the traffic, the studios, the phone calls, and the air carried that scent of eucalyptus, dry earth, and sometimes the faint sweetness of wild sage. On warm nights, windows stayed open, music drifted, not the famous kind yet, just the ordinary kind. Radios playing softly, maybe a guitar, someone singing to themselves as they cooked dinner. Late at night, the canyon settled into its own rhythm. The distant hum of traffic below faded to almost nothing. Crickets took over the soundtrack, joined by the occasional hoot of an owl perched somewhere. If you listened carefully, you might catch the soft creak of wooden houses adjusting to the cool night air, a gentle settling that seemed to whisper, "Tomorrow, something new might begin." And the canyon was affordable. It was slightly hidden, and most importantly, it had space. Space to live, space to think, space for the kind of people who would soon arrive with guitars and ideas. The canyon didn't know it yet, but its quiet roads and its quirky houses were about to host a revolution, the good kind. By the early 1960s, Laurel Canyon had a reputation. Not in a flashy billboard on Sunset kind of way, but in the way that artists always seem to find each other. Down the hill on Santa Monica Boulevard, there was a club called the Troubadour. If the canyon was the living room, the Troubadour was the front door. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just another low-slung LA building, the kind you could walk past without a second glance. But step inside, and you entered a small world that somehow felt infinite. The Troubadour was where careers started. It was also where careers ended, usually at 1:30 in the morning, after an audience reaction that could charitably be described as polite. On any given night, you might find a crowd that was part hopefuls, part fans, and part people who were pretty sure they'd been promised a ride home. Guitars were everywhere. The air smelled like beer, cigarette smoke, and that faintly sour tang of wood that's been absorbing music for years. It was a proving ground, a place where a new song might get played for the first time. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but when it did, word traveled fast. And that's where Laurel Canyon comes in. The canyon was just a short drive away, though short with Los Angeles traffic was always an optimistic word. Musicians would leave the Troubadour late at night, guitars still buzzing in their hands, and head up the winding roads towards home. The canyon was perfect for them. It was affordable, it was quiet, and this is important, the neighbors didn't call the cops when music went past midnight. In fact, the neighbors were probably playing too. Soon, Laurel Canyon became more than just a place to live. It became a place to create, a place to experiment, a place to borrow an egg from the house next door and return it as a co-written chorus. Houses turned into informal rehearsal spaces. Back porches became listening rooms. Driveways were filled with a rotating cast of cars belonging to people who'd just dropped by. And because the canyon roads were narrow and twisting, there was a good chance you'd run into someone you know. Literally, in your car around a blind corner. This was the early stage of the canyon's musical life. Not yet the gold record era, but the folk era, A time when it felt like every other house had a guitar propped up in the corner, a notebook on the table, and someone quietly working on something that might just end up changing music. If Laurel Canyon had a town square, it wasn't an actual square. It was Mama Cass Elliott's living room. Cass's house was legendary, not because it was grand or sleek or even particularly tidy. It was legendary because of who came through that front door and what tended to happen once they were inside. From outside, it looked like any other canyon home of the time. Wooden siding, a driveway that made delivery trucks nervous, a front porch where someone might be reading the paper, drinking coffee, or tuning a guitar. But step inside, and you'd find something more valuable than square footage: space for people. Cass had that rare quality. She could make anyone feel like they belonged, whether you were a chart-topping singer or a guy who happened to know someone who once played tambourine for a chart-topping singer. You'd end up with a plate of food and a spot on the couch. Her home became a meeting point. Not officially, mind you. There were no invitations printed, no guest list at the door. But word got around. If you drifted toward Cass's place, you'd probably find someone to play with, talk to, or just listen. On any given afternoon, the scene could be casual or electric. One moment, you might see Graham Nash sitting on the floor, idly picking at a guitar. The next, Joni Mitchell might be in the corner quietly listening, or quietly deciding whether the song needed a better bridge. Cass had a knack for introductions, too. She connected Graham Nash to Joni Mitchell. She brought people together who didn't even realize they needed to meet. Sometimes she paired songwriters. Sometimes she paired future couples. Sometimes she paired people who really should not have been paired. But that's how you end up with half of rock history. And the food? Well, the food was eclectic. Sometimes it was a proper spread. Sometimes it was just a pot of chili, a loaf of bread, and whatever drinks people had brought. But nobody seemed to mind. People didn't come here for the menu. They came for the music, the laughter, and the feeling that they were really a part of something. There's a famous, possibly exaggerated story about an afternoon at Cass's where Crosby, Stills, and Nash happened to sing together for the first time in her living room. The harmonies worked, and the rest is history. Whether or not it happened exactly that way doesn't matter. What matters is that it could have happened that way, and that's the kind of place her home was. Evenings could go late. Someone would start a song. Someone else would pick up a harmony. Someone would remember they were supposed to be somewhere 2 hours ago and decide, nah, this was better. And sometimes, if you were lucky enough to find yourself on Cass's back porch late at night, you might catch a glimpse of a familiar four-legged silhouette wandering across a neighbor's roof. The goat, already a Laurel Canyon legend in the making, seemed to have its own schedule, appearing and disappearing like a furry reminder that in Laurel Canyon, the impossible was just another Tuesday. It wasn't organized. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't even particularly consistent. But Cass's house was the kind of place that made you want to linger. And in the canyon, lingering could lead to songs, albums, or even entire careers. In a way, Cass's living room was Laurel Canyon in miniature, warm, slightly chaotic, endlessly creative, and just structured enough to make magic. If Laurel Canyon had a house band, and really it didn't, because everyone was too busy forming their own, it might have been Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and sometimes Young, when he felt like it. By the late 60s, Stephen Stills was living in the canyon. Graham Nash was living in the canyon. David Crosby floated through the canyon, sometimes in a house, sometimes in a cape, always with opinions. Their houses weren't palaces. They were the kind of places where a living room doubled as a rehearsal space, where guitars leaned against walls, where a dining table might be buried under sheet music, half-empty coffee cups, and the occasional ashtray that looked like it had seen too much. There's a story told enough times that it has to be at least partly true, that their three voices first blended perfectly in a Laurel Canyon living room. Stills on guitar, Crosby and Nash leaning in, their harmonies locking into place like they'd been waiting for each other all along. The sound was tight, it was effortless, and it was different. In a neighborhood where folk music often meant one voice and one guitar, Crosby, Stills, and Nash built something bigger. Harmonies that rose and fell like the hills themselves. Songs that felt both intricate and easy, like they'd always been there, just waiting for someone to sing them. Neil Young joined them occasionally. Neil was the wild card, a brilliant musician, unpredictable as the canyon weather. One day he'd be in the studio, the next he'd vanish, possibly to work on a solo project, possibly to drive a hearse cross country. With Neil, you just never quite knew. Their collaborations weren't all peace and harmony, despite what the songs might suggest. There were strong personalities, strong talents, and very strong opinions. Recording sessions could be intense. Tours could be tense. But when the music worked, it worked so well that the rest seemed worth it. From the canyon, their sound spread. Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, Helplessly Hoping, Our House, songs born from living rooms and late-night jams became part of the national soundtrack. If you'd been driving up Laurel Canyon Boulevard on a summer evening in 1969, well, you might have heard them, faintly through open windows, blending with the sound of crickets and a car shifting down for a sharp curve. And in those harmonies, you'd hear the canyon itself. Joni Mitchell didn't just live in Laurel Canyon. She seemed to absorb it. Her house, famously painted yellow, sat perched above the road like it was in no hurry to be anywhere else. It wasn't big, it wasn't grand, but it had something better. Light. The windows opened wide to the California sun. From the porch, you could see down into the winding roads of the canyon, and beyond that, the faint haze of Los Angeles on certain afternoons. The kind of view that made you want to sit down with a guitar and maybe never get up again. In the early morning hours, before the canyon fully woke, you could hear the gentle sounds that would become the day's soundtrack. The soft rustle of eucalyptus leaves catching the first breeze, the distant call of a mockingbird practicing its repertoire, and sometimes, just sometimes, that faint sound of a piano being gently tested, as if someone was greeting the day with a few careful chords. The house became a kind of creative sanctuary, not just for Joni, but for anyone who passed through. Graham Nash spent time there, enough time to write Our House, inspired by their life together. You know the song, Two Cats in the Yard, and there were, in fact, two cats. They probably didn't realize they were about to be immortalized on vinyl. Inside the rooms weren't staged for company, they were lived in. A piano here, a stack of notebooks there, lyrics on scraps of paper, sometimes coffee rings staining the edges. The furniture didn't match perfectly, but then neither did most of the canyon's residents. The yellow house was quieter than Mama Cass's gatherings. There were no raucous parties spilling onto the porch, no constant flow of guests. Joni's house was contemplative, a place to write, to work, to think. In the mornings, sunlight poured through the windows and spilled across the floors. You can almost imagine her sitting at the piano, hair falling into her face, working on a chord progression. Or maybe at the table with a cup of coffee, sketching something in the margin of a notebook. Her songs from this era, Ladies of the Canyon, Big Yellow Taxi, Woodstock, well, they all carry that sense of place. You can hear the canyon in them, the warmth, the space, the quiet intensity. Neighbors would sometimes stop by. Conversations might turn to music or art or just the logistics of finding a decent parking spot in the canyon that week. And through it all, Joni kept writing. Her yellow house became part of canyon mythology, a symbol of the quieter, more introspective side of the music scene. The kind of place where a sunny afternoon could turn into an album without anyone planning it. And in the stillness of that house, the canyon's music took on another dimension, softer, more personal, but no less powerful. Laurel Canyon had a light side, sunlit porches, harmonies floating through open windows, cats stretched out on steps, indifferent to rock history being written just a few feet away. And then there was Jim Morrison. But the canyon was large enough, winding enough, mysterious enough to hold all kinds of music. Just as the road itself shifted from bright afternoon curves to shadowy evening bends, the musical landscape could change around any corner. And sometimes that change came with leather pants and poetry. The doors weren't exactly canyon the way Crosby, Stills, and Nash were. They weren't sitting cross-legged on someone's deck writing about love in three-part harmony. They were different, a little wilder, a lot stranger. Jim Morrison lived just off the canyon, in a place on Love Street. The name fit, in its own way. His partner, Pamela Courson, ran a boutique down the hill. Their life together had all the ingredients of a canyon story: music, romance, creativity, and just enough chaos to keep the neighbors curious. The Morrison house wasn't a yellow sanctuary like Joni's, or a welcoming hub like Cass's. It was more like a cave with poetry on the walls. Jim's world was part rock star, part mystic, part lizard king. Neighbors might hear him reading late at night, or singing, or just laughing with friends, or nothing at all. The kind of silence that made you wonder if perhaps he'd slipped out of town for a week without telling anyone. On those silent nights, when Morrison's house was dark and still, you might catch other sounds drifting through the canyon air. The distant hum of an amplifier from another direction, the soft hoot of an owl claiming its territory, or the gentle click-clack of something four-legged picking its way across a rooftop. Perhaps that mysterious goat again, making its rounds under cover of darkness. And yet, the canyon suited Jim. The winding roads, the hidden houses, the sense that just around the bend there might be a new story waiting. Jim liked boundaries that blurred between music and poetry, between stage persona and private life, between inspiration and improvisation. The canyon was good for that. Jim Morrison's presence gave the canyon a certain balance. While most of the scene revolved around acoustic guitars and gentle harmonies, the Doors brought organ swells, darker chords, and a sense of mystery. Their music felt like night in the canyon. You could imagine Riders on the Storm playing as rain tapped on a roof, headlights catching glistening pavement, eucalyptus leaves shifting in the wind. For every sunny afternoon on a deck, there was a shadowy evening with Morrison somewhere in the background, leaning against a doorway, smiling like he knew a secret you'd never quite figured out. And that was the beauty of Laurel Canyon. It wasn't one mood, it was all of them. Bright, quiet, wild, mysterious, and always just unpredictable enough to keep you listening. At the intersection of creativity and complete unpredictability, where the canyon's folk rock gentleness met something altogether more experimental, stood a house that seemed to defy every convention the neighborhood had quietly established. At the very bottom of Laurel Canyon, near where the boulevard meets Sunset, there once stood a house that looked like it had been built by someone who wasn't entirely convinced straight lines were necessary. Frank Zappa's log cabin. Now, calling it a log cabin was generous. It was enormous, a sprawling wooden structure from a time when the canyon was less a musician's haven and more of a weekend getaway for wealthy Angelinos. But by the time Zappa moved in, it had taken on an entirely different identity. Part rehearsal space, part crash pad, part surrealist art installation. From the outside, it looked like something out of a fairy tale that had been reinterpreted by a very ambitious set designer. Wooden beams, odd angles, and a roof that seemed to rise and fall like a piece of experimental music. Inside was another story entirely. Step through the door, and you were in Zappa's world. The main living room was cavernous, with ceilings so high you half expected to hear an echo if someone clapped. Guitars leaned in corners. Cables snaked across the floor. A drum kit sat off to the side, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to pick it up. Upstairs, the bedrooms had a revolving cast of occupants, band members, visiting musicians, friends of friends who'd fallen asleep mid-conversation and just stayed. You could wake up one morning and find that your housemate was Alice Cooper rehearsing in the basement. The kitchen was a space of legend. Sometimes it produced actual meals, sometimes it produced experiments, culinary or otherwise, that no one could quite identify. The refrigerator might contain both an entire case of beer and a single unlabeled jar of something no one wanted to open. And then there was the basement. The basement was the beating heart of the log cabin. It was a rehearsal space, a recording space, and just a gathering space. At almost any hour of the day or night, someone was down there playing. It might be Zappa himself. It might be the Mothers of Invention. It might be an entirely different band that had wandered in and decided to stay. The log cabin wasn't just a house. It was a crossroads. People flowed through it constantly. Musicians from all over Los Angeles found their way here, either to collaborate, to listen, or simply because they'd heard something interesting might happen. Sometimes it was carefully planned. A rehearsal, a jam session, a meeting of musical minds. Sometimes it was entirely accidental. Someone showed up to borrow an amp, stayed for a conversation, and then ended up on an impromptu recording. And then, of course, there were the parties. Zappa wasn't much of a drinker, and he didn't run the log cabin like a frat house. But there was always something happening. Always a group of people gathered in a corner talking about a project. Always a song being worked out in one room while another room erupted in laughter. The log cabin, like everything in Laurel Canyon, came with its share of myths, too. There were rumors of secret tunnels, a story that persists even though no one's ever produced a reliable map. Some said the tunnels connected the cabin to other houses or to hidden rooms beneath the canyon. Most likely, it was just the kind of story that grows naturally in a place where unusual things are always happening. There were stories of wild late-night sessions that turned into entirely new songs, stories of guest musicians who played one unforgettable night and then disappeared into history. And of course, the goat. At least one story insists there was a goat, not living in the log cabin, but wandering the grounds outside. Was it Zappa's? Was it a neighbor's? Or was it just another canyon oddity passing through? No one seems to know, but it fits the tone perfectly. In Laurel Canyon, a goat outside Zappa's door, barely even rated as unusual. The log cabin was more than a place to crash. It was an incubator. Ideas were tested here. Bands rehearsed here. Albums took shape in conversations that drifted from kitchen tables right down to basement amps. It was messy. It was loud. It was unpredictable. And like everything in the canyon, it was temporary. The log cabin, as Zappa knew it, didn't last forever. But the music and the collaborations that came out of it still echo through rock history. Driving past that spot today, you'd never know the stories the walls once held. But if you close your eyes, you might imagine the faint hum of a guitar, a laugh from the kitchen, and the endless possibilities of a house where something was always about to happen. By the early 70s, Laurel Canyon was still alive with sound, but the volume had shifted. The raucous parties at Mama Cass's were quieter now. Zappa's log cabin wasn't quite the same revolving door of chaos. The canyon still hummed with music, but it was a softer hum, and into that hum stepped Carole King. Carole King didn't come to the canyons as an unknown. She had already written a mountain of hits in New York's Brill Building era. Songs for other artists, songs that had climbed charts. But in Laurel Canyon, she wasn't just writing for others. She was writing for herself. She settled into a modest home in the canyon, the kind of place where a piano could dominate the living room and nobody minded. The canyon didn't care about flashy. All it cared about was creativity. There's something almost mythical about the idea of Carole King sitting at her piano, working on what would become tapestry. Morning light filtering in through the windows, a coffee cup on the table, sheet music scattered, lyrics scribbled into a notebook. The house would be quiet in those morning hours, save for the gentle testing of chords and the scratch of pencil on paper. Outside, the canyon was waking slowly. Birds calling from the eucalyptus, the distant sound of someone starting a car, perhaps the soft patter of that mysterious goat picking its way down a steep driveway. You can almost hear it, those first notes of So Far Away floating out into the canyon air. The songs on Tapestry were intimate but universal. It's too late. I feel the earth move. And you've got a friend. Songs that felt like conversations, sometimes with someone else, sometimes with yourself. The canyon was the perfect place for that kind of writing, removed from the glare of the city, yet still connected to a community of musicians who understood what you were doing. James Taylor was part of that community. Taylor's music had the same quiet strength as King's. His guitar work, his voice, they had a way of pulling you in without demanding anything. Like the canyon itself, his songs didn't shout. They invited you in, and once you were there, you didn't really want to leave. He and King collaborated, supported each other, played on each other's albums. The canyon was full of that kind of cross-pollination, not because of contracts, but because everyone was within walking distance, or at least within a short drive if you didn't mind the curves. Life in the canyon during this time had its own rhythm. Morning light creeping down the slopes, the sound of birds, a distant dog barking, the faint hum of someone's amplifier warming up, coffee brewing in kitchens that opened onto decks with views of the city below. Now at night, the canyon settled into a different kind of music. Windows stayed open to catch the cool air, and if you walked the winding roads, you might hear the gentle finger-picking of an acoustic guitar from one house, the soft murmur of a piano from another. It was quieter than the folk explosion of the 60s, but no less magical, just a little more intimate, like the whole neighborhood was sharing a whispered secret. Neighbors might stop by, not for a party, but just to talk. Someone might ask for feedback on a new song. Someone else might drop off a record. There was less chaos now, but no less creativity. The songs being written were still absolutely remarkable, just a little quieter. Tapestry became one of the best-selling albums of all time. James Taylor's albums from this era are still considered classics. But beyond the records, what made this period special was the atmosphere that allowed them to exist. The Canyon wasn't a factory. It wasn't a record label. It was a place. A place where someone could wake up, pour coffee, sit at a piano, and create something that would still be played decades later. And while the Canyon would eventually change again, for this brief moment, it was perfectly in tune with the quieter, more reflective side of music. Laurel Canyon didn't have formal invitations for parties. It had a network. One person mentioned it to another that something was happening. That person mentioned it to two more. And by the time the sun dipped below the ridge, there were 20 cars parked half on the road, half on driveways that were definitely not designed for this many Volkswagens. These weren't parties in the Vegas sense. No neon signs, no red velvet ropes. Canyon parties were a hybrid of potluck, jam session, and family gathering. If your family was made up entirely of musicians, artists, and one neighbor who brought a goat. Yes, that goat. The goat has been part of Canyon lore for so long that no one really remembers who actually owned it. Some swear it was Frank Zappa's. Others claim it belonged to a neighbor who insisted it had free-range tendencies. The story goes that the goat somehow ended up on the roof of a Canyon house, and it stayed there, not just for an afternoon, but as an ongoing presence. People would just drive by and glance up, and yep, they'd see it there, calm, collected, surveying the scene like the canyon's unofficial mascot. And by now, the goat had become something of a canyon institution. Musicians would reference it in conversations. You know, the house with the goat on the roof. Visitors would be given directions that included helpful landmarks like, you turn left after you see the four-legged rooftop resident. Some claim to have spotted it at multiple locations, as if it had somehow figured out the optimal rooftop route through the entire neighborhood. It wasn't a problem. It was just the canyon. If you could accept three-part harmonies drifting out of a bungalow at midnight, you could definitely accept a goat on a roof. Canyon parties were as unpredictable as the guest lists. You might walk into a living room and find half a dozen people strumming guitars, and then in the kitchen, someone would be stirring a pot of chili. In another corner, a heated debate about guitar tunings might be happening over a bottle of wine. Mama Cass's gatherings were the most famous, but she wasn't the only one. Joni Mitchell's place, though smaller, had quieter evenings, more intimate, less crowded, but no less impactful. And then Frank Zappa's log cabin hosted its own unique brand of chaos. And then there were the spontaneous ones. A casual conversation turned into a plan. Someone brought wine, someone else brought friends, and suddenly the house was very full. Music was always at the center. At any given party, you could hear songs in progress, a verse tested out, a harmony added, a lyric debated. Sometimes the song would become a hit. Sometimes it would be forgotten by morning. But in that moment, it felt like everything mattered. In one house, you might hear Crosby, Stills, and Nash working through a new arrangement. In another, Joni Mitchell playing something so new she hadn't even named it yet. And then in the background, always, that hum of creativity. And not everyone in the canyon was a musician. There were also actors, painters, filmmakers, and then there were regular neighbors who learned quickly that quiet hours were more of a suggestion. But there was a tolerance for it. The parties didn't feel exclusive, they felt like part of the neighborhood fabric. You might not be in the living room playing, but you could hear the music drifting out of the windows. Even the goat didn't seem to mind. Looking back, it's tempting to romanticize these nights, and maybe that's okay. The details blur, the myths grow, but the feeling remains. These gatherings, they weren't about fame. They weren't about carefully planned collaborations. They were about being in a place at a time, surrounded by people who were creating something together. The goat on the roof, the guitars on the porch, the songs that floated into the night. They all became part of the Laurel Canyon story. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Cass's Candle Company, the only candle brand guaranteed to smell like a Laurel Canyon porch in 1972. Each one is hand-poured in a canyon kitchen by a woman who definitely knew how to host and is definitely sober now. Choose from signature scents like sun-baked vinyl and Leonard Cohen sweater. Warm, slightly mysterious, probably borrowed and never returned. Light one. Leave the door open. Someone interesting might wander in. Or you might just drift off, wondering whose guitar that was in the corner. Cass's Candle Company, where every scent tells a story you're not sure you remember. Now, back to the canyon. By the late 1970s, Laurel Canyon was changing. The music hadn't stopped. There were still songs drifting out of open windows, still jam sessions in living rooms, still guitars leaning against walls in houses half hidden by trees. But the hum was quieter now. The wildest nights had given way to calmer evenings. The constant traffic of musicians moving from house to house slowed. The goat, if it was still around, had probably found a more peaceful rooftop. Part of it was natural. The scene that had flourished in the late 60s and early 70s had run its course. Some musicians moved away to Malibu, to Topanga, to entirely different states. Others stayed but retreated into more private lives. And part of it was the world outside the canyon. The music business had really changed. The mellow singer-songwriter sound that had defined much of the canyon's heyday was no longer the center of the musical universe. Disco was lighting up dance floors. Punk was emerging in clubs. New sounds, new scenes, new places. Laurel Canyon wasn't chasing trends. It never really had. But the industry's focus had shifted, and the canyon no longer felt like the axis of the musical world. The houses themselves seemed to settle. In the early days, the canyon's homes felt alive, porches full of people, music spilling onto decks, driveways crowded with friends' cars. By the late 70s, those same houses were quieter. Gardens grew in. Windows closed more often. The furniture stayed in place a little longer. Inside, people, they were still writing, still recording, but the constant drop-ins and surprise collaborations had slowed. The soundscape changed too. where once you might have heard a dozen different conversations and guitar riffs blending into the evening air, now there were longer stretches of peaceful quiet, just the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the city below, and perhaps the soft murmur of a television or radio from behind closed windows. It wasn't a loss so much as a transformation. The canyon had always been a place to create. Now it was a place to rest. If you drove through the canyons in the late 70s, it still had its magic. The road still climbed in sharp curves. The air still smelled of eucalyptus. The view of Los Angeles from a porch at dusk was still enough to stop a conversation. But the feeling was different. The canyon had always been slightly apart from the rest of the city. Now it felt even more self-contained, a little more private. There was a sense of history here now. Stories attached to houses, a sense that things had happened, legendary things, even if the music was quieter now. Not everyone left. Some artists put down roots. Carole King had moved on from the Yellow House, but her music still lingered in the air. Joni Mitchell was evolving her sound, moving into jazz influences. Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt, and others still had ties to the canyon. The people who stayed were no longer at the center of a musical movement, but they were still creating. The canyon was still a place for art. It just wasn't as loud about it. The late 70s weren't the end of Laurel Canyon's story. They were more like the last song of a set. The one where the tempo slows, the lights dim, and everyone takes a breath. The parties had quieted, but the canyon remained. Its roads still twisted through the hills. Its houses still held pianos, guitars, and stories. Laurel Canyon wasn't fading into silence. It was shifting into a quieter key. Laurel Canyon was always a place, but by the 2000s it had become a legend. The road still twisted, the houses still leaned, the eucalyptus still swayed in the evening wind. But the canyon we picture when we talk about the Laurel Canyon scene, well, it isn't just a neighborhood. It's a memory. One that's been polished, edited, and replayed until it almost feels like a movie that we've all seen. Part of that is because the stories never stop being told. Some stories are inseparable from the canyon. There's Mama Cass, hosting musicians in her living room, introducing Graham Nash to Joni Mitchell, possibly with a casserole in the oven. Every telling of that story makes it sound more inevitable, like the canyon itself willed those introductions into existence. There's Frank Zappa's log cabin, with its endless parade of musicians, strange rehearsals, and unconfirmed goat sightings. The tunnels, the basement jams, the rumors that only seem to grow more detailed as the years pass. Jim Morrison, Wandering Love Street, Joni Mitchell's Yellow House, sunlight falling on her piano, David Crosby in a cape, because, of course. These are images that stuck, and like all good myths, the truth matters less than the feeling. Over time, the documentaries began to tell the canyon story with a much softer focus, less about the business of music and more about the poetry of the place. The camera lingered on empty porches where harmonies once rose. Narrators spoke in hushed, almost reverent tones about the creative magic that had happened here. Even that goat, when mentioned, became less of an oddity and more of a gentle symbol of the canyon's wonderfully unconventional spirit. The retelling became part of the canyon's charm. Each documentary added another layer to the legend, until the neighborhood itself seemed to exist in a kind of golden hour lighting, permanent and peaceful. Over time, Laurel Canyon stopped being just a location and became a character in its own story. Think about it: the winding roads, the sharp curves, the hidden driveways, the houses perched on the hillside, sometimes almost invisible until you're right in front of them. The way sound carries, a guitar riff floating from one porch to another. The canyon shapes the story. It's not flat like the rest of Los Angeles. It hides things. It reveals things slowly. You don't just get to Laurel Canyon, you drive into it. And in some ways, that's how you experience its history, too. Every retelling of the canyon story picks its myths to keep. Sometimes Mama Cass becomes the benevolent mayor of the scene. Sometimes Zappa is the eccentric genius holding it all together at the base. Sometimes the goat is mentioned. Sometimes the goat's left out, waiting for the next storyteller. The myths, they work because they feel true. They capture the feeling of a place where music, personality, and geography all lined up in a way that feels impossible to recreate. Of course, not every canyon story involved herbal tea and harmonies. In the years that followed, a few louder voices rolled through, sometimes with amps, sometimes with chaos. Motley Crue spent time in the hills, though, let's be honest, most of their dirt was done down on the strip. The Red Hot Chili Peppers lived here too for a stretch, which explains a few dents in the local tranquility. Even Slash grew up around here, but long before the top hat. And Alice Cooper once got discovered just down the hill, screaming his way through a Zappa audition in the log cabin basement. They didn't exactly blend in, but the canyons always had room for the occasional racket. Why does the canyon story keep getting told? Well, partly because the music still lives. These songs aren't museum pieces. They're still on playlists, still on soundtracks, still playing softly in coffee shops. And partly because the canyon represents something we're not sure we can have again. A time when big songs came from small rooms, when careers began on porches, when music, it wasn't just a product, it was a part of daily life. Every time a new documentary comes out, people fall in love with Laurel Canyon all over again, even if they've never been there, even if they've never even been to Los Angeles. Laurel Canyon is a story we tell because it makes us feel like creativity is possible anywhere, if the conditions are right. Laurel Canyon still exists, of course, but if you drive through today, you won't see a museum. You won't see billboards announcing historic music scene next right. You'll just see a neighborhood. And yet, if you know where to look, the echoes are everywhere. Laurel Canyon Boulevard hasn't changed much. The road still climbs in sharp, blind curves, just as likely to make newcomers tap their brakes as it was back in 1968. The same eucalyptus trees still lean over the asphalt, dropping their scent into the air. And on some mornings, mist hangs in the curves, like it's reluctant to move on. In the afternoons, the sunlight still filters through in narrow beams, touching the same stretches of pavement it always has. And if you roll down your window, and listen carefully on a quiet morning, you might catch the same sounds that once provided the backdrop to history. The soft whisper of wind through eucalyptus, the distant call of a hawk circling high above the ridges, and sometimes, just sometimes, the faint sound of someone playing guitar on a hidden porch, keeping the tradition alive in their own quiet way. Many of the old houses are still here, though some have been remodeled, repainted, or rebuilt entirely. The yellow house where Joni Mitchell once wrote Ladies of the Canyon is still yellow. Mama Cass's old place looks quieter now, but if you stand in the driveway, you can imagine the sound of a dozen voices rising in harmony from inside. Frank Zappa's log cabin is long gone, but the stories haven't left. The ground it stood on is still there, holding whatever traces of late-night rehearsals and whispered myths the soil decided to keep. Some houses are newer now, modern builds with clean lines and big glass windows, but they still perch on the hillsides like the old ones did, looking out over the same winding roads. The canyon is still home to musicians, though they're just as likely to be writers, producers, or film composers now. There are actors, directors, and people who work far outside the entertainment world, but are drawn to the canyon for its views, its quiet, and its history. The people who live here today walk their dogs on the same streets where Crosby might have walked in a cape. They shop at the Canyon Country Store, which hasn't changed much in decades. The store still sells snacks, coffee, and groceries. And if you stand in the parking lot, you can look up the hill and see the same ridges and houses that once framed an entire era of music. What's most surprising about Laurel Canyon today is how much of its feeling remains. The noise of Los Angeles still fades as you climb the hill. The air still feels a little cooler. There's still a sense of stepping out of one world and into another. And if you drive through slowly, you can almost sense the ghosts, not in a haunted way, but in a friendly, familiar way, like the canyon is layered with moments. Joni on her porch, Cass at her table, Morrison walking down Love Street. Sometimes, when the light hits the road just right, the years fold over each other. The present-day houses look like they've been here forever. The modern cars parked in driveways, they could just as easily be old Volkswagens if you squint. The music born here still plays, not just in documentaries or oldies stations, but in everyday life. Tapestry still finds new listeners. Crosby, Stills, Nash Young harmonies still sound like summer evenings. The Doors still echo through many a playlist. And for the people who know the history, driving through the canyon is like listening to a soundtrack with the volume turned low. The songs aren't loud, but they're there, woven into the hillsides. Laurel Canyon of today isn't the same as it was in the 60s and 70s, because it couldn't be. But it doesn't need to be. It's still a place that feels a little apart from the city around it. A place where creativity feels possible. A place that carries its own quiet magic. And if you drive it at sunset, the road winding, the eucalyptus swaying, the air cool against your arm, well, you might feel like you've stepped back for just a moment. The music is still there. The stories are still there. And the canyon still waits, as it always has, for whatever might come next. And so, We leave Laurel Canyon. The road winds back down, each curve feeling a little more familiar on the way out. The sunlight has slipped low behind the ridges now, painting the eucalyptus in gold and shadow. Down below, Los Angeles is starting to sparkle in the dusk. The music hasn't stopped. It never will. It's just quieter now. A guitar on someone's porch. A piano in a house you can't see from the road. The canyon doesn't need to announce itself anymore. It just is. The night sounds are beginning now. The gentle symphony that once lulled musicians to sleep after long evenings of creation. Crickets tuning up in the brush. The soft hoot of an owl somewhere in the darkness. The distant hum of the city below, muffled by the hills. And maybe, if you listen very carefully, the soft patter of something four-legged making its way across a rooftop. The last guardian of the canyon's sweetest mysteries. The names and the faces we passed tonight. Joni, Cass, Crosby, Stills, Nash, Young, Morrison, Zappa, King, Taylor. They're all part of the story, but so is the place itself. Laurel Canyon was never just about the people. It was about the feeling of stepping into a world slightly apart from the one below. A world where music was as natural as the air, where collaboration could happen in a kitchen, and where history was made by accident as often as on purpose. Tonight, maybe you'll dream of a porch in the hills, of voices rising in harmony, of a road that twists and climbs just out of view. And as you drift off, the canyon will still be there, quiet, waiting. Good night.